So in this video, I wanted to talk about the differences that I see between FDR New Deal Democrats and modern Democrats. And I would view modern Democrats to be divided basically into two groups. One group are the progressive Democrats, represented by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or Bernie Sanders. And they're a smaller group. There's a much larger group that are more moderate neoliberal Democrats, basically in the model of Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. And those are really different groups. The progressives are very different from the modern neoliberal Democrats. But I think both of those groups are significantly different from FDR New Deal Democrats. And when I say New Deal, the New Deal was a series of programs, public works projects, financial reforms, regulations that were enacted by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States between the years 1933 and 1939. This is basically the projects and reforms and things that were created by the government in order to get the United States out of the first Great Depression, which they did successfully. So FDR New Deal Democrats are different than the modern progressive Democrats, and there's a few ways that they're actually also the same. FDR New Deal Democrats, there was basically three major components to the New Deal: relief, and that was relief for like unemployed people. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created, which was a series of work relief programs between 1933 and 1942 for unemployed, unmarried men. And it was originally for young men ages 18 to 25 and was eventually expanded to young men ages 17 to 28. The Civilian Conservation Corps did a lot of great public works projects. They worked on roads, they worked on parks, and in a strange way, they were kind of the original Green New Deal, at least in that era. They stocked streams with fish. They did a lot of environmental controls to. It was basically a works program that did a lot of great things for the environment. It's a little bit different than what we would have in the current Green New Deal, but that was the relief part of the New Deal. Recovery was financial reforms. And one of the most underreported aspects of the New Deal, one of the most important pieces of legislation in America, was the Glass-Steagall Act. And what the Glass-Steagall Act did was it separated commercial or investment banking, banks like J.P. Morgan, from banks that basically, like your mom and pop type banks for not civilian banks, but what are commercial banks, just banks that basically take deposits. What they didn't want was they did not want the speculation being done with depositors' money. So there was a separation between those two. Also, a lot of stocks that were sold on margin at the time. And what I would like to say, the most important thing you need to know about Glass-Steagall was it was the law of the land between 1933 and 2001. Glass-Steagall was overturned in 2001 under the Clinton administration. And I think that's one of the core reasons that the economy began to destabilize. So a lot of times when you talk about these financial reforms and you hear people on Wall Street talk about how radical they are, this was Glass-Steagall and the way this was structured was part of our financial system for 50 years, and it basically held the country together and stopped banks from creating undue speculation, and in essence also creating privately held tax systems. Banks would take a tremendous amount of risk when the market was good, and a lot of people would make bonuses. Then when the market turned bad, those risks were dumped onto the taxpayer, like you saw in the 2008 mortgage crisis and like you're seeing right now. So a lot of that stuff, a lot of the regulations was trying to stop what would be considered a privately held tax system, where the rewards go to individuals, but the penalties and the downside go to the taxpayer. And another big part of the regulation was balancing the collective power of individuals against the overwhelming power of big business and the financial system. So there needed to be more of a balance in power between those two with things like labor unions. Um, so if I was to describe the New Deal, there were some very key aspects of the New Deal that I think are a little bit different than what the modern progressive movement. For instance, respect for democracy mixed with socialism. The New Deal was a political movement, but it always respected democracy. Democracy was very important within the New Deal. The New Deal actually respected markets. It was trying to backstop some of the excesses of markets, and it was trying to regulate the parts of the market that would destabilize the financial system. And most of those parts of the market that would destabilize the financial system, I would label as privately held tax systems. They require taxpayer money in order to function without giving the taxpayer anything in return. And basic respect for liberties. There was never a question about freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, any of those types of things. Overall, if I had to describe what a lot of the reforms of the New Deal, they were always attempting to socialize opportunity, but not really socialize money, unless you got down to the amount of money that people just needed to live. For instance, the Civilian Conservation Corps, obviously you can't have a lot of men in their early 20s traveling around the United States without jobs. That's a recipe for disaster. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was, at that point, was just creating a base level. Also, minimum wage was created in the New Deal. There was that base level. But anything beyond that was always socializing opportunity, but not actually socializing the money, giving people the opportunities to go to college or to have some type of job or to learn some type of skill, but not necessarily just taking the money and dividing it up. I would describe the New Deal, the FDR's New Deal, as heroic protection for the little guy. It was always talking about the little guy. And so in some ways it was class-based, but in a really general sense. It was the little guy against the business class. Now, I would like to compare that to modern progressive Democrats. And modern progressive Democrats, there's a few places where they do overlap with some of the concepts in the New Deal, but I think they're vastly different. And I would describe modern progressive Democrats as, again, as people like AOC, Bernie Sanders, and a lot of the modern progressive ideas don't necessarily come out of economics as much as they come out of humanities. A lot of it has roots in communism and Marxism. And it's really oftentimes very hard to describe modern progressive Democrats because it's a very ambiguous philosophy, and it's easy to find contradictory positions. So, for instance, the only sort of unifying thread of modern progressive Democrats that I really could find would be the opposition to probably anything that Donald Trump does, even when what Donald Trump is doing would be basically considered like a cornerstone of progressive Democrats' policy. And an example of that would be when Trump pulled troops from Syria and Afghanistan. In any other politician had done that, it would have been cheered by the progressive Democrats. But again, there was like a lot of opposition to that, which is contradictory to the anti-war stance that most progressive Democrats would espouse. So progressive Democrats are oftentimes based around intersectionality, which is a philosophy of class or gender or race, and it's about socializing money itself based on a philosophy of victimhood. Another key feature of modern progressive Democrats is that they have an undying support for the socialist label. In other words, any country that calls itself socialist will oftentimes be mentioned by the progressive Democrats. And the problem with the socialist label is there's a lot of different kinds of socialist countries. There's countries like in Scandinavia, which I would describe as being closer to New Deal Democrats. In Scandinavia, they have elections, they have elected officials. Countries like Sweden have very successful um, uh, free markets. For instance, IKEA is a very successful company that comes from Sweden. Nokia. There's lots and lots of companies that come out of Scandinavia. These are not government-owned companies. There's not a centralized command and control. There's democracy, and there's also a lot of ambitious social programs, but there's still a basic respect for free markets. With modern progressive Democrats, you hear them cite countries oftentimes like Cuba or Venezuela, and to some degree, though not so much, maybe China. And these are sort of old school, centrally planned economies. But there's one very important aspect about all three of these countries. All of them have a president for life. So basically, they're very, very authoritarian. They're not democracies. In fact, they're almost monarchies. Cuba had Fidel Castro, and who was the leader of Cuba for 30 years. Venezuela currently has Maduro, who is, for all practical purposes, the president for life of Venezuela. As a general rule, even if they're socialist, where they have a lot of government programs, and they'll oftentimes have these command and control government programs. Oftentimes, too, these countries are countries that try to use collectivist agriculture. In the former Soviet Union, which was kind of the archetype for all of these, they had farm collectivization. Venezuela and Cuba both tried creating collective agriculture, which almost invariably leads to famines. Some bright spots with these countries is even though they're authoritarian regimes that require a police state in order to maintain, they oftentimes, at least in the case of Cuba and somewhat in the case of the former Soviet Union, do a great job, a unexpectedly good job in the medical field. And I think there are some reasons for that I'll get into a little bit later. Modern progressive Democrats, and they'll often cite Cuba or Venezuela, and when they talk about why these authoritarian regimes with presidents for life fail, it's they have to try to defend the socialist label. So they'll oftentimes say things like, "Oh well, it's not really socialist," or they'll talk about U.S. embargoes, which is basically the United States won't trade with Cuba or they won't trade with Venezuela. I think that's not a very good argument, because what you're in essence saying is that in order for our economic system to work, in order for the economic system in Venezuela to work, it requires us to be able to trade with a much more free market economy. We can't survive in our socialist, communist, command and control economy without the ability for us to trade with market economies. The problem with that is that Venezuela, Cuba, they can still trade with all kinds of countries around the world. I mean, for the most part, Cuba can trade with most of Europe. They can trade with Russia, China, most countries except the United States. That's the big exception. So what they're really saying when they say, "Oh, well, we can't survive because of this embargo," is that our economic system is so weak that it cannot survive unless it can trade with the economic system that we oppose. That's a big reason that I've never thought that the embargo argument for the failure of socialist countries with authoritarian president for life leaders was a good argument. So the basic philosophy on a lot of the modern progressive Democrats, and it's very ambiguous because the philosophy is all over the place. You can find contradictory statements, contradictory policies, but I would describe at least a good chunk of it is it's legislation based around redistribution of wealth rather than redistribution of opportunity. And it's oftentimes it really doesn't address regulations in the larger financial market, like the derivatives market. It's not trying um, to regulate what I would describe as privately held tax systems, as opposed to just saying we're just going to automatically redistribute wealth between the wealthy and between different groups. It also, one of the other things is that it oftentimes with modern progressives, because it's so racially based, it oftentimes has is opposed to free speech. You see that a lot on college campuses, where they try to shut down other economic policies around with the argument that it's racist if you don't follow this specific policies. Now, there are places that modern progressive Democrats and New Deal Democrats overlap, and progressive Democrats do support some policies around that I think that are part of the New Deal. They're originally part of the New Deal. One of those is they've oftentimes supported Social Security. Social Security was a part of the original New Deal that was created by FDR. They oftentimes support they'll support Medicare and Medicaid, and they want to actually expand it. Medicare and Medicaid were brought in by Johnson in the '60s, and they were brought in under Social Security, so it augmented some of the New Deal legislation that FDR had created. Another area that I thought was very similar to programs during the New Deal was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. There was, after the 2008 financial collapse, they wanted to create a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to protect the little guy against large banks and things like that. They basically did not want to. They wanted to stop the predatory loans or predatory interest rates and create something that that rebalances the favor, rebalances power in the towards the individual. So I would describe FDR's reforms as socializing opportunity, not money, having a basic backstop where, like the minimum wage or the Civilian Conservation Corps, that would create a backstop, and whereas the current modern progressive Democrats really want a redistribution of resources around a philosophy of victimization and grievances, and I think the problem with that philosophy is, one, it'll never work. No one will ever be elected under a victimization philosophy. And my main argument for that would be the election of Barack Obama. When you watch Obama's speeches, Obama was never a victim. Obama was a hero that was leading America to a brighter future, and he never basically spoke of victimization. That's very different from the way Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez frames things as being and oftentimes defends herself against when she wants to make an argument. She'll often bring up her race as one of the reasons that her argument should have value, rather than just saying, well, my argument has values. And so that's a very common tactic that she uses. That's not something that you ever really saw with Obama, and especially you didn't see anything like that when he was running for office. Obama was definitely, at least philosophically and rhetorically, was always a hero in every speech that he gave. I don't think that America would elect a politician that would frame themselves as a victim, because I think that scares people. They want somebody that's strong enough to represent America's interests globally. And so I think that by default, those type of philosophies are never going to, you're never going to have a president elected around that speaks, that tells a victimization narrative. It's always going to be more of a heroic narrative. And that's just kind of a style difference.